Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show dedicated to having charitable philosophical discussions and to helping you develop and reason through your views. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Graham Oppy. We speak on his work within philosophy of religion, specifically on God and naturalism. If you find value in this content, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing the podcast as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. And without further ado, I bring you Dr. Graham Oppy.
All right. Well, welcome back to another episode. Today with me, I have Dr. Graham Oppy. Dr. Oppy, thank you for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So before we get started on today's topic, if you wouldn't mind telling our listeners who you are and what you do.
Okay, so I'm a professor of philosophy at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, and my main field of expertise is philosophy of religion. I have interests, fairly wide interests in philosophy, so and partly this is a function of its being philosophy of religion because metaphysical questions, epistemological questions, questions about science and so on come up in any discussion of philosophy of religion.
Yeah, for sure. So how did you get into philosophy? Is this something that you kind of started out early on, like in high school times, or is it something that, it wasn't until you went to college to where you started saying, hey, you know what, I kind of like philosophy. I like to think about these things.
So I got interested in philosophy before I left high school. I, for my 16th birthday, one of the birthday presents I got was a copy of Bertrand Russell's autobiography, and it's quite a large work. I read it all, and I thought I want to be like him. So uh, that's that. So that was kind of the beginning. Uh, Russell was something of a polymath. He studied maths as well as philosophy. So I did the same. So I did a bachelor of science and a bachelor of arts. Eventually, I wound up becoming a philosopher.
Yeah, and so is it during that time as well where you started kind of going into more philosophy of religions? Because as you mentioned earlier, there's so many different other branches of philosophy, ethics, epistemology, but they all kind of come together at some point. But yeah, why philosophy of religion in particular?
So, as I've said elsewhere, that was a bit of an accident. My PhD was in philosophy of language, and at that point, I figured that I would be somebody who ended up working in kind of philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, metaphysics, those kinds of areas. But I came back from the States to Australia after I finished my PhD and I was unemployed. And I had the opportunity to teach a course in philosophy of religion. And things kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, Interesting. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of a good segue into a kind of our topic, which is naturalism and religion a little bit. And so, I'm not sure where the best place to start, but I think one of the places we can start is by defining what naturalism is. And in your book, you make a distinction between kind of ontological naturalism and methodological naturalism. So, if we want to kind of explain to our listeners what those two are and kind of how it relates to your overall framework.
Okay, so there are naturalism is a very broad tent. There are lots of different views that count as naturalistic, and it's kind of hard to say uh, or to find a definition that everybody who wants to count themselves as a naturalist would be happy with. So, one aspect of naturalism, or one thing that some people who call themselves naturalists want to hang on to, is the idea that really the sciences are the kind of guide to knowledge, and we should really limit ourselves in our believing to what we can get from the sciences. Now, that's related to the idea of methodological naturalism in the following way that uh, lots of people think that, at least as far as the kind of methodology of the sciences go, we should be treating everything as if we were metaphysical naturalists, right? So that there are certain kinds of things that we just won't countenance in our scientific investigations. Okay, so what about metaphysical naturalism? Well, again, there's different ways of saying what that is. The way that I like to think about it is that according to the metaphysical naturalist, in a way, the universe is all that there is, the universe and the things that are in it. Uh, if you think of the universe as a kind of causal domain, all of the causes are, all of the causally active things are natural things. All of the causal relations are natural causal relations. And here, the what's going to count as natural is things that are amenable to the kinds of investigations that you might do in the sciences, bearing in mind that on this way of thinking about things, it needn't be that the sciences can tell you everything about things. So, for example, if you think about people, you might think that there's various ways in which we're governed by norms of reason or moral norms or so on. And we shouldn't expect the sciences to be particularly good at investigating the content of the norms. Nonetheless, the things, the people, are things that can be investigated by the sciences in various ways. There's a whole lot of stuff that science can tell us about our biology, psychology, etc., etc.
So, kind of in a way, what you're saying is that with naturalism, at least as the one you've described, is that the whole universe, it's naturally in the sense that it's everything within it is just causal. How did you word it? It's something like with in the book I'm thinking of as well, like uh,
Okay, so my slogan was there are none but natural, you know, no, yeah, none but natural causes, none but natural objects involving none but natural causes, or something like that. I can't
mhm,
remember the slogan off
yeah.
the top of my head. But what gets ruled out will be things that sit causal things that sit outside the universe. So on this view, it can't be that thinking of the universe as being all of natural reality. There can't be a cause for that any more than on any other view there could be a cause for the whole of causal reality. That's just incoherent, right? A cause for causal reality would have to be part of it. So there can't be something that's a cause for the whole.
So, kind of going on with this, then, if there's nothing in this view, if there's nothing but natural kind of causal entities or properties, um, that seems to leave out, as what you just suggested, other non-natural things that other, I guess, worldviews or theories kind of bring into it, such as like a theistic worldview.
Right. So things that will be ruled out will be things like gods, but also there are other elements of potentially theistic worldviews like demons and angels, things like that will be ruled out as well. Um, but there are there are non-theistic religious worldviews that involve things will also be ruled out. So I'm thinking that karma, for example, that would be a kind of non-naturalistic mechanism. That's going to be ruled out too.
So then, when we're kind of moving forward, then like when you're comparing worldviews, so in your book, The Best Argument Against God, you're comparing two um, big picture worldviews, and I think that's how you describe it, where you're taking all the data and um, as far as like a big picture, and you're comparing two different theses, such as you have naturalism on one hand and then theism on the other hand, and then we in that way you kind of systematically go through which one is more simpler and more theoretically virtuous, and one that is more simpler and theoretically virtuous and has fewer ontological commitments, you then say that that should be preferred.
Right. So I'm thinking there's a kind of background idea about theory choice, and I'm going to apply it here because I'm going to think of worldviews as just theories of everything. Right. So, uh, and although this might be an oversimplification, I think that the choice between theories can be represented um, in the following way. What you're interested in a theory is two dimensions: one, minimizing commitments, and one, maximizing explanation. And you look for the theory that does best at managing the trade-off between those two things. And on the one extreme, if you say there's nothing, your theory is as virtuous as can be with respect to simplicity, but it's hopeless at explanation because you've got nothing you can appeal to give your explanation. On the other hand, if for everything that happens you postulate some independent new um, ontology to explain it, then your theory is going to explain absolutely everything, but it'll score very, very badly on simplicity. And because the thing that you've been doing, just postulating new ontology every time, means that you miss out on a whole lot of um, even though you've explained everything, you've missed out on lots of explanatory connections between things if you go that way, or else you. Yet, at any rate, you've got this hugely, ridiculously baroque ontology. So the sweet spot's got to be somewhere in the middle. There's got to be some way of managing this trade-off between just postulating stuff all the time, new stuff to explain things, right? And the kind of drive not to believe in anything at all, right? So because we want to have both minimum commitments and explanation. Okay, so there's two things here that need explaining. One is what commitments are, and one
Hmm.
is about what explanation is. I'm not going to say anything really kind of interesting about explanation. There are different kinds of explanations. Um, Obviously, explaining by appealing to causes is one kind of explaining, but there's also kind of structural explanations of various kinds of things. There are other kinds of explanations too. But I take it that we kind of understand what we mean when we're thinking about um, explanation. And our theory will just have things in it, like this was caused by that. That will be the explanation. But the explanation commits you to this and that, right? In giving when that claims part of your theory. What's more interesting is on the other side. So, what are commitments? There's several different kinds. One kind of commitment is the commitment to the theory. So, uh, I'm thinking that the way to think about sort of how we determine whether one theory is simpler than another is to look at its axiomatization and just see which has got the shorter, simpler axiomatization. That's that's a kind of theoretical simplicity. It's not easy to work out who's got the simplest theory because it's very hard to axiomatize theories. But in principle, we could do that. And in practice, in certain kinds of cases, you'll be able to see that one theory is going to be simpler than another. Second thing is sort of how many primitive ideas did you need in order to explain the theory? So how many how many undefined terms have you got in your theory? Now that's there's a kind of trade-off between that and the first thing, because every time you add an explicit definition, that makes the theory a bit longer and more complicated. But in general, the more unexplained primitive expressions you've got in your theory, the worse. You'd like to do with less. Third, the thing that most people are going to be most interested in is, so how many different kinds of things, how many different things and kinds of things are there postulated in your theory? The fewer kinds you need to appeal to, the fewer things perhaps that you need to appeal to, the better. And all of those different things are bound up in the judgment about which theory is simpler.
Perfect. So now that we kind of have that a little bit on the table now, how does that play into in the first part of the book? You have two competing big pictures, such as minimal naturalism and minimal theism. So how do given this theoretical framework, how does this play into those two competing kind of worldviews or big pictures?
Okay, so what we have to do is we have to decide what's the data that we're going to compare the theories against. And so I'm going to imagine that the kind of starting point is that we've got these fully elaborated worldviews, right? So that's the first bit. You have to give an account of what the worldview is. In practice, we can't do that. In practice, we can't elaborate our worldviews. I mean, there are so many mundane things that we believe that are part of our worldview. But so this bit's going to be a kind of just a kind of model It's not something that you can actually do in practice. But imagine those two fully elaborated worldviews, one that's a kind of best theistic worldview and one that's a best naturalistic worldview. And look at all the things they agree on. And there'll be a vast amount of agreement. I mean, pick any naturalist and theist, there's an enormous amount that they agree on. All kinds of mundane stuff. Who's the president of the United States? Can cats fly? Right. Lots and lots of stuff. I mean, we agree actually about most things. And so I'm going to take everything that we agree on as the data that has to be explained. One thought that lies behind this is that if your theory postulates stuff that the other theory doesn't, you don't get any credit for explaining it, right? If your theory's got angels and demons in it, you've got some explanation of the activities of angels and demons, that's not an advantage against the theory that says there are no angels and demons, right? So that's why the data should be the stuff we agree on. There are kind of interesting consequences of thinking about the data that way that we might come back to and talk about later. But anyway, okay, so we've got this, there's the bit that we disagree about, and then there's all the stuff we agree on. The stuff that we agree on gives us a whole lot of commitments. The interesting question is about the stuff we kind of disagree about. But what we're interested in is overall the commitments, right? And the explanation. So if we're thinking about all the stuff we agree on, is one of the theories able to give a better explanation of it than the other? And then which one's committed to less? Now, the way that I argue it in the book, if we think about the data and we kind of partition it up in a sensible way, there's a whole lot of things to think about. And I'm going to argue that on all of them, there's no explanatory advantage for theism, right? So there's lots of data, and we can come back and talk about it in a minute. That's the kind of more controversial, I think of as the more controversial part of the project. It's kind of open-ended, and I think there's plenty of room for theists to disagree about my assessment of some of the bits of the data. On the simplicity side, it seems to me that kind of straightforwardly, and there are plenty of theists who agree about this, though not all of them do, that theists believe in everything that I believe in and more, right? So their theory has a bunch of extra claims in it because there are all these claims about God that just have no counterpart in my theory. They believe in God. They may also believe in angels and demons. And there's all of this ideology. They think that there's an omnipotent thing. They think there's an omniscient thing, etc., etc. None of that has any counterpart in my view. So I think it turns out that my view is simpler. And so the kind of argument that was sketched in the book, an argument which I say isn't ultimately successful, but still the argument that's sketched in the book is that naturalism is simpler and it explains all the data, at least as well as theism does. And so we should think that the naturalistic worldview is better than the theistic worldview. That's the outline.
So let's take at least one part of the data that I'm thinking of, that theism gives an explanation for, and then how naturalism can give an explanation for. So something about why is there something kind of rather than nothing, right? So you have the kind of like this argument of contingency that is typically argued for the existence of God. And so if you kind of want to outlining the argument of a contingency argument or some type of causation argument, and then they kind of how it's kind of used for the existence of God.
Okay, so you might think that, and I'll actually do it slightly differently from the way that you suggested. You might think that the naturalist can have no explanation for the existence of natural reality, whereas the theist does. The theist can say, God made natural reality. But if you want to go ahead and say that natural reality is obviously all contingent, something that we can come back and discuss later, then you might think that there can't be from within the naturalist worldview, an explanation of the existence of contingent things, because all you've got is more contingent stuff. Whereas for a theist can think that God exists of necessity, and you can appeal to the necessary being as an explanation for the existence of all the contingent stuff. Now, so you might think here's an explanatory advantage to theism. So I think that those kinds of arguments clearly don't work, and I'm going to try to explain why. So let's go back to just think about the sum of everything, right? Forget about whether we're a naturalist or a theist. Just think about everything. Is there an explanation for that? And if so, what could it possibly look like? Straight off, you might think, how could there be an explanation for that? But there's one possibility. You might think, well, maybe it's necessary that there's something. I haven't said anything about what it is, just there's this kind of sum of everything. It's necessary that there's something that explains why we get this sum of everything. Okay, now think about the details here. If you're a theist, you're going to think that the necessary thing, if you think that you need an explanation here, you're going to think that it's God and that God exists of necessity. If you're a naturalist and you're moved by these considerations, you're going to think, okay, there's something that exists of necessity. It's natural reality. That's what there has to be. Right? And now we've got the same explanation in each case, right? We're appealing to necessity to explain why there's something rather than nothing. And there's no explanatory advantage that goes one way rather than the other. Right? And it's open to us to say there's no explanation why there's something rather than nothing. It's brutally contingent. And there have been some theists who've gone that way, and there have been some naturalists who've gone that way. A naturalist, no less than a theist, can be undecided about which way to go. But what they can insist is that if the right way to go is to say the explanation here appeals to necessity, that's equally available to the naturalist and to the theist. So there's going to be no explanatory advantage here for the theist. That's kind of the strategy, the argumentative strategy.
Okay, so you're in kind of summary, you're saying that, I mean, when it comes to the explanation, before we're ever committed to either naturalism or theism, when we're looking at the sum total of everything that exists, does that have an explanation? And even if we were to think that there is an explanation,
In
an
terms of
explanation,
necessity.
one would be as of necessity, and that's neither postulating God as the necessary entity that created the universe, is on par with saying that the naturalist can just say, well, what's necessary is that it's natural reality is necessary.
Yeah. So you can say, if you like, it's the kind of the initial singularity or the initial state of the universe or something. I mean, you have various options about exactly what we're going to attach the necessity to, but from the really big picture, there's a sort of sum of everything. How are we going to explain its existence? Saying it's necessary looks like it's the only thing that we're going to be able to do that will explain it, and that's equally available on either side. So it's not going to be an advantage to the theist, and that's going to undermine arguments from contingency and first cause arguments and things like that. Once you have that thought,
What do you think about some theistic philosophers of religion that want to say, well, they don't think it's naturalistic, or it can't be a naturalistic explanation, because when we start actually thinking about what kind of property this necessary thing, whether it's natural or supernatural or non-natural, that's where the advantage comes from or comes into play. That's one question. The next one is that, does this also apply to because you said first causal argument, so something like the Kalam cosmological argument, like whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. So this also applies to that as well.
Okay, so the second question is easy. The answer is yes. Um, it's if you think about if it turns out that there's an initial state, then it can't have a cause because it wouldn't be initial if it had a cause. Right. So if you think that there's an initial state, you're going to think that the property that the initial state has, if you're going to have an explanation here at all, is that it's necessary. So if the theist thinks that, yeah, there's an initial state, it involves God and stuff comes from there, God exists of necessity. If you're a naturalist, you're going to think if there's an initial state, let's say call it the initial singularity, it's going to be necessary if we're going to have an explanation for it at all, and everything's going to come from there. So yes, this argument will take in the Kalam just as much as it takes in contingency arguments and other kinds of causal arguments. Less clear that it applies directly to kind of Thomistic arguments, but maybe we don't want to go there for this discussion. There'll be other kinds of things to say about those arguments. Okay, on the first question, there's nothing in naturalism that rules out modality. In fact, naturalists are going to need modality. If you think about causation as a kind of dependence, and you want to give a kind of explanation of causal relations, you're going to think of them as modal dependence relations. So naturalists are going to traffic in necessities and possibilities just as much as anybody else does. The kind of I have sort of controversial views about modality as well. The view about modality that I like is one which says, and I'll phrase this in terms of possible worlds rather just because it's easier, that all possible worlds share some initial history with the actual world, diverge from it because chances play out differently, and where possibilities enter in is because there's chance. Now, on that view, it just falls out immediately that the initial state, if there is one, is necessary, right? So I think that there's a kind of theoretical justification for supposing that the initial state is going to be necessary. That's sort of prior to the kind of discussion about whether there's a God or not. So I don't think that there's any kind of lack of justification or any clash with naturalism in the assumption that in supposing that if there's an initial state, that initial state is necessary.
Okay. And so this kind of rests on what you're talking about is your kind of what you like about, or I guess is a theory of modality, or is it just something that like it's something that you're sympathetic to about
so
that?
I guess it's, in a way, it's sort of like a theory of modality, I guess. So amongst philosophers, though less so amongst people who are first-year philosophy students and kind of ordinary folk, untainted by philosophy, there's this view that somehow or other conceivability, what you can imagine and imagine without there being any kind of apparent inconsistencies in it, is just outright possible, right? So you have, and so what you end up with is this idea that there's this vast range of possibilities, all kinds of bizarre things that we don't see could have happened, right? And I'm kind of resistant to that way of thinking about possibilities. Maybe this kind of fits with my general preferences for simplicity and kind of minimizing things. I think that if you're going to say that something's possible, you've got to justify it in a better way than that, right? And I think that the idea that you only need as many possibilities as you need to give you the chances that you need to explain the kind of causal history of the actual world, noting that once you've got those chances, So once you've got those possibilities, there'll be subsequent sort of playing out of chances that might give you things that you don't have in the actual world. But everything has to be consistent with the actual laws of nature and the way that the world was, the universe was early on. Right. That seems to me a much more satisfying story about possibility than, if you can dream it up and you can't see any contradiction in it, you're entitled to think it's possible. Now, you might think that we're just talking about different things there, but we are. But the subject here is about metaphysical
Mhm.
possibility. We're talking about something real. We're not talking about epistemic possibilities. It's not like the situation where the dice is spinning and I think, well, it could come up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. If I'm going to bet on it, I'm going to, I'm assuming it's a fair dice. I should, the odds are sort of, 1 in 6 that it'll come up 6. Because
Mhm.
that's just talking about our ignorance. That's got nothing to do with metaphysics. It's a
Mhm.
purely epistemic thing. And of course, there's a role for what people call possibilities there. There are kind of epistemic possibilities, but there's no ontology that goes along with that. All that that's doing is measuring our ignorance about outcomes. And so I want to set that topic to one side. We're not talking about that kind of possibility here. We're talking about sort of real ontological possibilities, ways the world could have really could have gone. Like imagine the world's deterministic and the dice is spinning. There's only one way it can turn out, right? Given the laws and the initial conditions and so on. And it's that sense of possibility that's the one that's the one that's relevant to the topic that we're talking about now.
So, just to make sure I'm tracking certain things right. So, in your kind of I guess, theory of modality a little bit, where um, the all possible worlds share history with the actual world, and um, the reason. Well, okay, let me see if I'm understanding how you also worded it in the book. Whereas, like the laws of physics, those values have to be a certain way. Like that's uh, the reason why those are the cases because it's necessary for those to exist. So there's could be like I guess a question or where I'm thinking of is there could be an infinitely many different possible worlds, but the reason why we're here rather than not those other possible worlds is because the values of the laws of physics had to be a certain way. Is that accurate or am I?
So, so I think not really. So I'm thinking that um, the laws of nature are just necessary, right? So this is a minority view, but a view that various people have held in the last 30 years or so. So the laws of nature couldn't be different from how they are. There's a different question about the values of various things that we now take to be physical constants, right? It depends whether they really have been constant from the beginning of the universe or not. So, so there's this fine tuning argument in, um, in, I guess, in contemporary physics as well as in philosophy, uh, based on modelling. It seems that if you amend the values of various physical parameters just a little bit, you end up with a universe that looks vastly different from the universe that we've got. Either it just blows apart and it's forever, it's just sort of empty space, or it collapses in on itself in a tiny fraction of a second. And either way, you don't get galaxies or stars, planets, or microbes, or cats, or human beings, right? Either way. Now, one of the questions is going to be about these quantities. Could they have been different? And it seems to me the answer to that question depends upon when they were fixed. If they've been fixed from the beginning and the beginning was necessary, then they couldn't have been different. But if there's a kind of cosmic roll of the dice and they get settled by chance at some later point, then yes, they could have been different because now we've got chances and the chances perhaps range over a vast range of different values. So that just seems to me to be a question that's left open by the approach that I've taken, whether those values are necessary or not. Right? It depends. Like you can imagine, there's a kind of something like a phase transition that happens at a certain point in the history of the universe, and suddenly the values get locked in. And before that phase transition, they weren't. And it's just a matter of chance what the values are assigned. Well, if that's how it went, then it really is just a matter of luck that the values are as they are. It really is just a matter of luck that it turned out that the universe was one where there are stars, etc. On the other hand, if it was fixed from the beginning, then it's not luck, it's necessity. Right, so that's the view.
Okay, and what you're saying is that if I'm hearing you correct, your view is the latter rather than the former of what you're talking about, or
So I'm undecided. Just as
okay.
in the previous discussion, I have no firm commitment about whether there was an initial state or not. Perhaps there's an infinite regress. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I don't see how I could possibly claim to know which way it goes. Equally with the values of the constants, who knows,
Mm-hmm.
right? At
Mm-hmm.
this stage, I don't think we know enough about the physics to know whether the values were there from the beginning, if there was a beginning, or whether they were settled at a certain point because there was a phase transition or something like that in the very early
Mm-hmm.
universe. And then the values got determined. So I suppose on both of these, there's something kind of attractive about the they were fixed from the beginning position, but that that's not something that I should think of as being a kind of reliable guide to the
Mm-hmm.
truth. It's
Mm-hmm.
just a hunch or an intuition, or if you sort of put my toes to the fire and say you must choose, then
Mm-hmm.
I'll opt for that, but not with any confidence. Right? I'm not going to claim that I've got particularly good reasons for thinking that it's got to go that way.
Okay. I kind of want to look now at the theistic explanation. So they're going to say that God was the initial, or the God is the being that created our universe. Now, why would you say that's not? Because I think in your book, you go over a little bit of some, I guess, maybe not maybe inconsistencies, or I think you've also said where it turns out to be just a brute contingency that we're here because God just decided to create a universe.
Okay, so the kinds of things that we've been talking about have their counterpart in the theistic theory as well. So suppose that at the beginning of the universe, the values are fixed, right, to be life permitting. Right? The values of the constants are fixed. That's because God picked those values. God created wanting those values to be the case. Okay, so now we ask, so what is it about God that led God to pick those values? Right. So, on a kind of natural way of thinking about this, you might think, well, God had preferences, and God's preferences are reflected in that choice. Question: was it necessary for God to have those preferences or not? If it was necessary, there's only one world God can make, or one kind of world that God can make, ones where the values are exactly as they are. On that version of the theistic view, it just turns out to be necessary. Right? On the other hand, suppose God could have picked any of a range of values. I mean, God's supposed to be omnipotent. Presumably, God could have, right? On a kind of unless there's some kind of curious hidden necessity here, right? Okay, so there's these other possible worlds where God makes different choices. God makes universes that just go boom and they're empty space forever, right? Now, okay, what's the difference? Why is it that in our world we've got the values being life permitting, where all these other universes don't? What is it? And one answer will be it's just a matter of chance how God's initially set up, whether he's got the preference for life or whether he actually just likes big explosions. Right? So it's not like there's a set of considerations that are going to apply on one side and not on the other side. So long as you think that when you're giving explanations, it's important that you be able to explain when one thing produces another, why it produces that thing rather than the bunch of other things that it might have produced. You're going to have just the same kind of explanatory gap on the one side, that is on the theist side, as you're likely to have on the naturalist side, right? A gap that you can overcome by going to necessity, right? But which it's hard to see how you could overcome it in any other way. So it'll just turn out to be chance, is the short answer. Why the universe is life permitting? It will just turn out to be chance if it's not necessity, on the theistic view just as much as on the naturalist view.
So let's just say those we go from there, and like, okay, you have chance on this end and chance on the other end. I guess then it's not really a critique of naturalism to say that we're just here by chance when you have, I guess, equal plausibility that the reason why God created a universe, a life permitting universe, is by chance as well.
Sort of ultimately rests in chance differences as well. Yeah, that's so that's the thought. So that's why the thought is there's no explanatory advantage here for theism either.
So I have a question. This is more, I guess, getting into kind of filtering into other things about then having the explanation of necessity from a naturalistic perspective, even, and also I think from a theistic perspective. So Van Inwagen, I can't remember exactly the argument, but he has an argument of necessity that goes into like our freedom. So if something necessarily follows from these kind of untouchable facts and they relate to our actions here, everything follows from it as necessity. So how does that apply to your explanation when it comes to naturalism, where not only does it involve if it involves necessity from here, does it follow then that everything that happens after the initial cause, or the initial state, I should say rather, is necessary? So yeah.
Okay, so Van Inwagen's also known for another argument, which is one that says that you can't appeal to a necessity to explain the sum of all contingency, because there's a question about the connection. If it's necessary, then it looks like it can't be a sum of contingency. It's got to be necessary. But if the connection's contingent, then there's a bit of contingency that's left unexplained because it's not part of what was supposed to be the sum of all contingency. So you can't appeal to what's necessary to explain the sum of all contingency, right? So that's another one of Van Inwagen's arguments. I'm quite sympathetic to that argument. The way that the naturalist view was described, right, there's lots of chance in it, right? So the evolution of state of natural reality is chancy, right? And that means that there's no threat of the kind that you're worrying about. If the connection, if you thought that the kind of evolution of state involved necessary connection, then yes, contingency would disappear from the picture altogether, right? But lots of other things will disappear too, given that we're supposing that the initial thing is necessary, the laws are necessary, the connection's necessary, and so on. I think that all dependence would disappear. You would just have this kind of block of stuff, all of which would be necessary, right? And that would be, and that's the only theist really who's kind of opted for a view like that is Leibniz. And Leibniz really did kind of paint himself into this position where it looked as though he was committed to the idea that there's only one possible world, everything's necessary. Most people don't want to go there. So you've got to have contingency somewhere. Sorry, you've got to have, and there are various places you can put it in. You can put it in so that the evolution of state is chancy, which is what I would like to do. If you suppose the evolution of state is necessary, then to get any contingency at all, you're going to have to put it into the boundary conditions or the laws. You're going to have to either say there's a kind of brute contingency in the laws, or that there's a brute contingency in the boundary conditions. Those seem less attractive to me, but they both seem more attractive to me than the Leibniz position that everything's necessary. So It was part of my view that I really am committed to there being kind of chancy, um, the sort of chancy evolution of state. But if that turns out to be wrong, I'm not going to go back to, well, everything's necessary. That's not my fallback position.
Okay, cool. No, I was just curious about that. And so moving forward, then now in the book, so you break it down into these two sections of minimal theism and minimal naturalism, and then you move on to what you call, or what has been labeled standard theism and versus standard naturalism. And in these ones, you talk about, I think it's more specific data, like such as like the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, and even with you're saying with that kind of data that we have, you would say that naturalism still wins out between the standard theistic view.
So I actually don't like the distinction that I drew in that book between the kind of restricted positions and the kind of standard positions. I would abandon that now. And the way that the distinction was, what in practice the distinction was first of all to deal with all the cases where people are inclined to think that there might be an explanatory advantage to theism. And then in the next bit, to deal with the cases where you might think that, I mean, people might be inclined to think that there's an explanatory disadvantage to theism. Right. So that part of the discussion um, uh, is perhaps not necessary for the argument as I develop it in the book. But I wanted to say something about evil, for example, as it's quite common for people, including many theists, to think that evil gives some advantage to naturalists over theists. If you're a kind of perfect being theist, it's kind of not straightforward to explain why there's imperfection, right? Naturalists don't have that problem because they don't have the commitment to there being a kind of perfect source. Now, for the purposes of the argument of that book, it's irrelevant whether um, naturalism has an advantage over theism in some cases or not, because all I needed to argue was that in every case, it doesn't turn out that theism has an advantage over naturalism. So the discussion of uh, evil and hiddenness and whatever else is in that part of the book uh, is kind of uh, aiming for a very weak conclusion, right? And uh, you still might find some theists who want to challenge what I say in that part of the book, but I don't think that you'll find many. I expect that you'll find lots of theists who want to challenge what I say in the earlier part, where I'm picking all of those things where there are kind of existing theistic arguments which suppose that considerations about why there's something rather than nothing, or the fine tuning, or morality, or reason, or consciousness, or whatever, is some advantage for theism. And that's kind of where the more controversial, interesting arguments in the book sit. I'll say one other thing. From way back, I've argued that kind of logical arguments from evil are not knockdown objections to theism, and evidential arguments from evil really don't carry that much weight against theism. So, unlike lots of other naturalists, I'm not particularly invested in arguments from evil or arguments from hiddenness or whatever. But that's because I really am invested in this other argument that uh, that naturalism just does better at explaining at managing the trade-off between minimizing commitments and maximizing explanation. And all on its own, that's a sufficient reason to be a naturalist.
So there's a couple of things, kind of wanting to move then from just talking straight on a little bit of naturalism. So there's in your book, Naturalism and Religion. I think it's a more updated version, I think, on some of your views. Naturalism, you start off with a quote, which is that naturalism has consistently shown itself to be a non-scientific religious perspective that is adverse to impartial inquiry into the nature of reality, and that it can be as a religion, its prejudice and tolerance of fundamental human intuitive understandings and things like that, etc.
Yeah, right. That
What
quote from Conservapedia. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, where do you stand according to that now? And yeah, what do you kind of think overall? Like, kind of what have you thought about that?
So, well, haven't I mean that quote? I think probably wouldn't be a quote that's representative of um, philosophical theists
Mm.
in general, but it's certainly representative of opinion of a wide range of theists who are not particularly philosophical. I mean, I guess that's where I would stand on the quote. I
Mhm.
wanted to start with that because I wanted to think about the kind of broader um, context in which this book is being written, and to think about the kind of internet discussion, theism versus naturalism, things like that.
And so overall, then, kind of in concluding, because we're coming up to our hour mark, um, the last chapter in the book, you spend quite a bit of time relaying that does naturalism defeat religion? And so, kind of when it comes down to it, kind of conclusion to naturalism.
So the book, the book, that book, Naturalism and Religion, uh, considers various questions about whether one thing defeats another. Does science defeat religion?
Hmm.
Does
Hmm.
philosophy defeat, and so on? Um, and in every case, my answer is no. So I don't think that um, naturalism defeats religion. There's an argument that I've developed, which I think naturalists will suppose, not all naturalists, but some naturalists will suppose is a kind of compelling argument in the following sense, that it seems to them, right, that the premises are true and the conclusions support the premises and so on. But it's a, in the nature of the case, it's a very long and complicated argument. There's all sorts of points where you can disagree with it. And so I don't imagine that this argument should persuade theists to become naturalists. And I don't suppose there's any other argument. After all, I said it, the earlier book was called The Best Argument. And the idea was it's the best of a very bad lot, right? There just aren't good arguments here, arguments that ought to persuade people to change their minds about stuff. This is as good as it gets. And there's all kinds of ways that you can resist it. That was the kind of idea behind the book. So of course I'm not going to think that naturalism defeats theism in that kind of sense, that um, you know there's some intellectual obligation that we've all got to be naturalists. I also don't think that that's kind of in the cards, like, in 50 or 100 years, that it will be true that we've all got an intellectual obligation to be naturalists. Um, so that's kind of the big picture take on the last part of the book.
Okay, and so I guess I have just a follow up question when it comes to those kind of big picture commitments and stuff. So what you're saying is that I mean, I think this is just in philosophy, right? There's not really any knockdown argument against positions. Um, and so when it comes to the naturalist versus the theistic big pictures, do you what do you make of kind of like I don't know, a Wittgensteinian kind of framework where they're just we have all these are commitments and they're not how what would Wittgenstein say? They're not um I'm losing it here. They're not not that they're not comparable, but you're not going to compel the other side uh towards the other because there's different commitments ontologically and
So,
just epistemically.
so I'm kind of sympathetic to the view that um, that that you can kind of reasonably hitch your star to different wagons in philosophy, and you can do it in religion too. And there, and you you needn't be at fault, kind of intellectually, for doing that. I don't think that it's quite the same as the kind of Wittgensteinian picture where the people are playing different language games and there's a kind of mutual incomprehension, really. If you don't speak the language, you really don't understand it, and that people. So his thought would be kind of that naturalists just when naturalists say things that they take to be um, reasons for not engaging in the the religious language games, that they're just displaying some misunderstanding. I don't think that's right. There are various reasons why that doesn't seem like it's right. And one of them is that people change sides. There are there are people who are now naturalists who were once religious. There are people who are now religious who were once naturalists. And it's not like their comprehension of their language, the whole stack of language just suddenly dropped out the moment that they changed their opinion. Right. So I don't think there's any problem about understanding. I think that it's kind of useful to actually have discussions about these topics to enlarge understanding about the kind of range of opinions that people can have. And that it's not clear that that's a particularly Wittgensteinian thought either.
Okay, awesome. I guess in closing, one question I want to ask you is that does naturalism entail, um, I don't know, some type of, I don't know, like nihilistic worldview? Like if there's no non-natural property, and I'm thinking of some, I guess there's a couple of thoughts I have. One, what do you think of value properties? If they exist or if they are non-natural, or maybe they are just natural properties, and they're identical in some way. And if they're not, if there are no identical natural value property that's identical to a natural property, but it's not non-natural, does that where does that leave people? Because this seems more like a practical implication, right? About meaning of life and right and wrong, and
So, given that I characterise the natural in terms of the kind of causal domain, I think that the kind of natural versus non-natural distinction doesn't apply to a whole range of domains. So I think that naturalists can be Platonists, so they can suppose that they're abstract objects. Naturalists can certainly accept mathematics and morality, and they can suppose, if they want, that there's this kind of Platonic ontology that goes along with it, or they might rather be nominalists of a certain kind and think that you can have truths about mathematics and truths about morality without there being any specifically mathematical ontology or moral ontology. I like that second approach, but and many naturalists do, but that's in keeping with the kind of minimize your commitments, right, and maximize explanation approach. It's not, and it's not that all naturalists are going to go that way. So, I mean, just to say a little bit more about morality, I think that there are necessary moral truths. I think that it's just a kind of necessary truth that it's wrong to torture infants for your own pleasure. I don't think that there's any extra ontology that you need there, because I don't think in general that necessities require any kind of ontology. So I don't see that there's any problem, right, any barrier to being a naturalist and accepting various kinds of moral principles, any more than that there's a barrier to being a naturalist and accepting certain kinds of mathematical principles. If anything, I think perhaps, I mean, here I'm following one of my former colleagues at Monash, Justin Clark Doan, that probably mathematics is trickier than morality for naturalists, but mathematics is tricky for everybody. So.
okay, interesting. And so I guess every time I ask a question and then you answer it, I have another follow up question. So kind of in closing, I guess, what do you think about the role of intuitions and how it plays into big picture stuff and I'm thinking of like intuition, like kind of like a version that Michael Humer calls, I mean, he has a book, Ethical Intuitions, but kind of just like a phenomenal kind of like not phenomenal, but like intuition in the sense of like once you grasp a concept, you kind of immediate. It's like a self-evident kind of.
Yeah. So I guess I have a different view. I mean, I don't think that intuition plays a particularly important role in philosophy. I think of intuitions as just, I mean, if something seems intuitive to you, it's just part of your theory, right? Intuitions are just a certain kind of belief. So this is there are there are there's kind of a division amongst philosophers between the people who think that we have these kinds of intellectual seemings that have some kind of evidential standing. And the people who think that when you're talking about intuitions, what's intuitive to you, you're just talking about what you believe, right? So on that side, there are people like Tim Williamson, David Lewis, there are various people. And on the other side, there are people like Humer or Niven Klimenega had ACU and so on, right? And on that, my stance is not the kind of stance that people like Humer take.
Okay, interesting. I guess that's pretty controversial. I was talking to Russ Schaefer Landau yesterday, and where he takes a very intuitionistic role in his metaethical theory. So I was just curious to
Yeah.
see how what you've thought about all that stuff.
Right. So, I mean, I guess I'm kind of skeptical about the idea that you can think of your intuitions as somehow being evidence for the theory that you accept. I'm a kind of skeptic about that. But, you know, it's like lots of things. There's
Yeah.
pick any topic in philosophy, and there's very widespread disagreement.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we're coming up. We just passed the hour mark, and don't want to take too much of your time. I think you have a book coming out about it's a debate. I'm not sure the other author, but I think it's you, and I think Humor has a book in the same kind of series.
Right. So there's a bunch of books coming out in this series. So the series is edited by Ty Goldschmidt, and my co-author is Kenny Pierce from Trinity College Dublin. And as it happens, I got the proofs today. So we are doing the index and doing the very final things. It's supposed to come out October 21. So, and yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it come
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I can't wait when it's out, and I'll probably have that on the queue, and uh, look forward to reading it.
out. Cheers.
Yeah, and then is there a place where people can find you, or I'll definitely leave the books that we talked about and kind of covered. Leave those in the description for the listeners. But yeah, if there's a place that you blog on, or you have a
Um, that's kind of tricky. I never really thought about it like that. So I have a Facebook page that lots of people are attached to. I have a Twitter feed that lots of people are attached to, but I don't. I have only very intermittently blogged. Um, so,
yeah.
but if people want to contact me, they can just send me an
Okay,
email.
perfect.
I'm pretty good at responding to emails. I might be slow, but I get
Mhm.
around to it eventually.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate talking to you.
Thank you.
And that concludes another episode of the Reason Through podcast. See you next time.